It was an ordinary day, and everything seemed peaceful. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when I noticed something strange. My 6-year-old daughter, Lily, was unusually quiet. Normally, she would be running around the house, asking me about her toys or what's for dinner, but today was different. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was just playing, or reading, or simply relaxing. But as time passed, I began to wonder where she was. I called out to her, but there was no response. I decided to go looking for her. As I walked through the house, I could hear a faint sound coming from the front door. It was the kind of sound that made my heart beat faster, a door creaking open, followed by soft footsteps. I rushed to the door, and that's when I saw it. Lily was standing outside in front of our neighbor's house. She was holding something in her hand, something that made her smile in a way I had never seen before. It was candy, bright, colorful candy. I felt a knot in my stomach. How did Lily end up outside? And who gave her that candy? My neighbor, Mr. Jennings, was standing in his front yard. He was smiling too, and for a moment, it all seemed so innocent. But the smile on his face didn't sit right with me. It was too wide, too friendly, and something about the way he was looking at my daughter made me uneasy. I called out her name, and she turned to run back to me, but the candy in her hand was a warning. What was happening? Why did he offer my little girl such a thing? Lily came running back to me, her little legs carrying her quickly across the front yard. As she reached me, I gently took the candy from her hand, trying to stay calm. I didn't want her to feel scared, but I also didn't want her to think that everything was okay. I knelt down to her level, asking, "Lily, where did you get this candy?" She looked up at me with big, innocent eyes and said, "Mr. Jennings gave it to me, Mom. He said I could have it if I came over and said hi." The way she spoke sounded so innocent, so sweet. But my heart sank. Mr. Jennings was not the kind of man I felt comfortable with. He always seemed a bit too friendly with the children in the neighborhood. He would smile at them in a way that was too eager, too strange. I had always kept my distance, but hearing Lily's words made my concerns grow. "Did he ask you to go inside his house, sweetie?" I asked her, trying not to sound worried. Lily shook her head, but there was something in her voice when she said, "No, Mom, he just wanted me to talk to him for a little bit." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Talk to him for a little bit. Why would a grown man want to talk to my daughter alone? This wasn't just about candy anymore. There was something off about the situation, and it made me question how well I really knew Mr. Jennings. Later that night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I stayed up late, sitting on the couch, thinking about the events of the afternoon. It felt like something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I kept replaying the conversation with Lily in my mind, trying to understand what had happened. As the clock ticked past midnight, I heard a sound outside the house. A soft rustling, like leaves being moved by the wind. I peeked out of the window, but I couldn't see anything clearly. The street was quiet. Too quiet. Then, as I watched, I saw it, the shadow of a figure moving near Mr. Jennings' house. It was just a glimpse, but it was enough to send a chill through me. The figure seemed to be standing still, watching my house. I immediately called my husband, telling him to come home as soon as possible. My mind raced with worry. Was I overreacting? Had I just imagined the figure? Or was someone watching us? I didn't know what to think. But the wind had carried a warning that night, a warning I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I decided it was time to have a serious conversation with Mr. Jennings. I couldn't ignore my instincts any longer. I needed to know what was going on. I went to his house, feeling both nervous and determined. As I approached the front door, I could hear the faint sound of a dog barking inside. Mr. Jennings answered the door with his usual smile, but this time, it didn't feel friendly at all. His smile seemed forced, almost too practiced. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," he said in his deep voice. "Is everything okay?" I tried to keep my tone calm, but I couldn't hide the concern in my voice. "Mr. Jennings, I just wanted to talk about yesterday. My daughter told me you gave her candy and asked her to come over to your house. I'm just wondering why." His expression froze for a moment, but then he quickly recovered. "Oh, that. It's just a little treat. I thought she would enjoy it. I didn't mean to make you upset." I felt something cold run through me at his words. It was too casual, too dismissive. I wasn't upset, I was concerned. I pressed further, asking, "Did you ever ask her to come inside your house?" "No, of course not," he replied quickly. "I simply gave her the candy, and she was free to go. Kids love candy, you know how it is." I wasn't convinced. Something in his voice didn't sit right with me. It was too smooth, too rehearsed. I thanked him for his time and walked back home, but as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. Why had he seemed so uncomfortable with my questions? Why did he feel the need to justify his actions? I spent the next few days watching Mr. Jennings closely, trying to piece together the mystery. Every time I saw him, I felt like he was hiding something. He was always outside, always watching, and always too friendly with the children in the neighborhood. I couldn't explain it, but my gut told me that something wasn't right. I spoke to a few of the other parents in the neighborhood, but no one seemed to think anything was wrong. "He's just an old man," they would say. "He's harmless." But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something wasn't adding up. I needed to know what he was really up to. One afternoon, I decided to follow him. I waited until he left his house, walking down the street like he always did. I kept a safe distance, watching his every move. He didn't head to the store, or anywhere normal. Instead, he walked straight into the woods behind his house, where I had never seen him go before. I felt a chill run through me. What was he doing in the woods? I stood there, watching, waiting to see what he would do next. As the minutes passed, I felt my heart race. Something was definitely wrong, and I had to find out what it was. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood behind a large tree, trying to stay out of sight. I had to be careful, I couldn't let Mr. Jennings see me following him. The woods behind his house weren't very dense, but there were enough trees to hide in. I stayed as still as I could, keeping my eyes on him as he walked deeper into the woods. Every step he took seemed to echo in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something dangerous. As I watched from my hiding spot, I saw him stop near an old shed that I had never noticed before. The shed was run down, covered in vines and moss. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Mr. Jennings stood there for a moment, glancing around like he was making sure no one was watching. Then, he opened the door. It creaked loudly, and a chill ran down my spine as I thought about what might be inside. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was going on. I waited in silence as Mr. Jennings disappeared inside the shed. The door closed behind him, leaving only a few seconds of quiet before I heard something that made my blood run cold, a soft, high-pitched giggle, almost like a child's laugh, coming from inside. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Was there a child in there with him? My stomach twisted with fear. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was this some kind of secret he had been hiding? I couldn't believe what I had just heard. My hands were shaking as I stood there, hiding behind the tree, trying to figure out what was going on. The sound of the child's laugh was still echoing in my mind. I had to make sure Lily was safe. But I also had to know what Mr. Jennings was doing inside that shed. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay hidden, but I knew I couldn't leave just yet. The sound of movement inside the shed made me jump. I quickly moved to another tree for better cover, careful not to make a sound. Through the leaves, I could see the door of the shed slowly creak open again. This time, Mr. Jennings came out alone, but something about the way he looked was different. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was tense, almost angry, as he slammed the door shut behind him. He walked quickly back toward his house, and my heart nearly stopped when he passed by the spot where I was hiding. I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't see me, but I stayed still and silent. After what felt like an eternity, he finally disappeared back into his home. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but my mind was racing. What had happened inside the shed? Why did I hear a child's laugh? And where did that child go? I waited for a few more minutes, then made my way cautiously toward the shed. The closer I got, the more my fear grew. When I reached the door, I slowly placed my hand on the handle. It was cold to the touch, and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears was so loud, it almost drowned out everything else. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle and slowly opened the door. What I saw inside made my stomach drop. The shed was dark, and it smelled musty. But there, lying on the floor, was a small, tattered doll, its head turned in an odd way, as if it had been thrown there in a hurry. And there, in the far corner, was something that made my blood run cold, a pile of old clothes, toys, and what looked like a few small shoes. It was as though someone had been hiding here, living here, in secret. I stood there, frozen, staring at the shed's contents. My mind was racing as I tried to make sense of everything I had just seen. The doll. The clothes. The toys. It was clear now, something wasn't right. My worst fears were coming true. There was a child involved, and it wasn't just any child, it was one of Mr. Jennings' secrets. My heart was pounding as I turned to leave the shed, but just as I stepped back, I heard a faint voice. It was coming from inside. I stopped in my tracks, not daring to move, straining to hear. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but there was no mistaking it. The voice was calling for help. My blood ran cold, and my knees felt weak. This wasn't just about candy anymore. This was something much darker, something far more dangerous. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police without knowing for sure what was happening. But I couldn't ignore it either. I had to protect my daughter. I had to protect all the children in the neighborhood. I made my decision then and there. I would confront Mr. Jennings once and for all. I couldn't wait any longer. But as I turned around to head back to his house, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a voice from behind me. "Don't go in there." It was a child's voice. I spun around, my heart racing, to find a small figure standing behind me. It was a little girl, about the same age as Lily. She was dressed in a faded pink dress and her hair was messy, like she hadn't combed it in days. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her voice trembled as she spoke again. "Don't go in there," she whispered urgently. "It's dangerous." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I looked at her. My first thought was that she must have been hiding in the shed. But why was she here, and why was she warning me? There was something strange about her. Something about the way she looked at me made me think she knew exactly what was going on. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel panic rising in my chest. "What are you doing here?" The little girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over her shoulder at the shed and then back at me, her face filled with fear. "You don't understand," she said softly. "He's not who he says he is. Please, don't go inside." Her words hung in the air like a warning, and my mind raced with questions. Who was she? What did she know? And most importantly, what was Mr. Jennings hiding in that shed? I stared at the little girl, trying to process everything she had just said. Her words didn't make sense. How could Mr. Jennings not be who he said he was? He had always been friendly, even though I had always felt uneasy around him. But this was something much darker. The warning from this child made everything feel real. I needed to know more, and I needed answers. I bent down to the little girl's level, my voice soft but urgent. Who are you? What do you mean by he's not who he says he is? The little girl's face went pale, and she stepped closer to me, glancing nervously at the woods behind her. He took me, she whispered. He said I could stay in his house. I thought he was nice. But he lied. I didn't want to stay anymore. Her voice wavered with fear, and my heart broke for her. She couldn't have been much older than Lily, and yet here she was, standing in front of me with a look of terror in her eyes. What do you mean he took you? I asked, my voice trembling. She looked down at the ground, her small hands twisting nervously. I was playing in my yard, and then he called me over. He told me there was a special toy at his house, something I could only see if I came inside. I didn't think it was a big deal. But then, I couldn't leave. He wouldn't let me go home. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. I was stuck in the shed. That's where he keeps the other kids. They don't know how to get out. My blood ran cold as the truth started to sink in. Mr. Jennings wasn't just a strange old man with a weird smile. He was something much worse. He had been taking children, luring them with promises of toys and candy, and keeping them locked up. I felt sick to my stomach. I needed to get this girl to safety, and I needed to stop Mr. Jennings before he could hurt anyone else. I couldn't waste another second. This was real, and Mr. Jennings was dangerous. The little girl had been trapped, and I was terrified to think that Lily could be next if I didn't act fast. I had to get help, but I couldn't take the chance of Mr. Jennings finding out that I knew. He might do something drastic, and I couldn't risk it. I turned to the little girl, trying to keep my voice calm. You need to go home right now. Tell your parents what happened. Tell them everything, okay? She nodded quickly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. But, what about you? She asked, her voice full of worry. What are you going to do? I'm going to make sure he can't hurt anyone else, I said, forcing a smile to reassure her. Go now, hurry. I'll be right behind you. She nodded again, looking at me one last time before running off toward the safety of her house. As I watched her disappear into the distance, I felt a surge of fear, but also a determination. I couldn't let this man get away with what he was doing. I had to stop him before anyone else was hurt. I turned and ran back toward Mr. Jennings' house, heart pounding in my chest. I needed to find proof, something to expose him for who he truly was. But as I neared his house, I realized something else. If he caught me snooping around, he might go after my daughter. I couldn't let him. The sun was setting, and the shadows of the trees were stretching long and eerie across the yard. I approached the back of the house, trying to stay out of view from any windows. As I peeked around the corner, I saw Mr. Jennings in his backyard, pacing nervously, his hands on his hips. It was clear that he was waiting for something or someone. I crouched low behind a large bush, trying to catch my breath as I watched Mr. Jennings from the shadows. My mind raced, thinking of what to do next. I had no idea how long he'd been pacing in his yard, but I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I needed to get inside the house and find something, anything, that would confirm my worst fears. I glanced around carefully, making sure he wasn't looking my way. There was a small window on the side of the house that was slightly cracked open, just enough for me to slip through. My heart was pounding, but I didn't hesitate. I moved quickly and silently, taking care not to make a sound as I approached the window. I carefully pushed it open, my fingers trembling with fear, and crawled inside. The house was dark, quiet, and felt almost too still. It was like stepping into another world, one I wasn't supposed to be in. The air inside was stale, filled with the smell of dust and old furniture. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The living room was cluttered, and there were signs of neglect, crumbled papers, dirty dishes, and half-empty bottles. I crept through the house, avoiding creaky floorboards, when something caught my eye, the photo frame on the mantel. It was an old picture of Mr. Jennings with a woman and 2 children. At first glance, the photo seemed normal, but as I looked closer, my heart dropped. The woman in the picture was no longer around, and the 2 children in the photo were the same ones I had seen earlier in the shed. It was starting to make sense. He had kept the children, kept them hidden away for years. I turned around quickly, hearing a sound coming from the hallway. It was Mr. Jennings, and he was getting closer. As the footsteps grew louder, panic set in. I had to find a way out, but I knew I couldn't leave without more evidence. The photo had confirmed it, the children were his prisoners. He had been keeping them all along, hidden in plain sight. I quietly moved toward the hallway, but just as I reached the door, I froze. Mr. Jennings was standing right there, just a few steps away, holding a strange object in his hands. I couldn't make out what it was, but the way he was holding it, like a weapon, sent a wave of terror through me. He knew I was here. "Don't try to run," he said in a low, cold voice. "You won't get away this time." I could feel my heart racing in my chest as I stood frozen in the hallway. Mr. Jennings was closer now, his cold eyes locking onto mine. My hands were trembling, and I had to swallow hard to keep from panicking. The object he was holding was becoming clearer. It looked like a long metal rod, something I didn't recognize at first, but it gave off an ominous feeling. The way he held it in his hands made me realize that he wasn't just angry. He was ready for something worse. "Why are you doing this?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky but determined. I couldn't let him see how scared I was. I had to keep him talking. I had to buy myself some time. Mr. Jennings' lips curled into a twisted smile, but there was no warmth in it, only coldness. "You never understood, did you?" he said slowly, as if explaining something trivial. "It was always about control. About keeping what's mine." His voice had a strange calmness to it, like he'd done this before and knew exactly how it would play out. I took a cautious step back, my eyes darting around the room for anything I could use to defend myself. I had to stay calm. I couldn't let him know how terrified I was, or I might never get out of here. "You're sick," I spat, trying to make my voice as strong as possible. "You can't just take children and keep them like toys." His smile faded, replaced by a dark glare. "They are better off here. Safer." He stepped forward, and I instinctively backed up, my mind searching for an escape. There was no way out the front, and the window was too small for me to fit through. My only chance was to make him underestimate me. Without warning, I turned and bolted down the hallway, hoping to find a way out. I could hear his footsteps behind me, growing louder, but I pushed myself harder. The door to the back of the house was just a few feet away, and if I could reach it, maybe, just maybe, I could escape. But just as I was about to reach the door, I heard him yell from behind me, "You think you can just leave? You're in my world now." His words sent a chill through me. I knew he wasn't going to let me go easily. I needed help, and I needed it fast. I slammed the door behind me, my pulse racing, as I ran out into the backyard. I couldn't believe I had made it out of the house. Mr. Jennings wasn't far behind, and I could hear his footsteps chasing after me. I had to think quickly. My mind was racing with plans, but nothing seemed to be working. The backyard was empty, quiet, and nothing seemed to be in my way. But I knew it wouldn't last long. He was relentless. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke through the silence. "Hey! Get away from her." I turned, my heart leaping into my throat as I saw a figure stepping out from behind the trees. It was the little girl, the one who had warned me earlier. She wasn't alone. Standing beside her was another child, a boy, who looked about the same age as she was. They both looked determined, their eyes fierce as they stepped toward me. Mr. Jennings stopped in his tracks. His expression shifted to confusion, then anger. "You shouldn't have come back," he growled, his grip tightening on the rod in his hand. But the little girl didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her voice steady as she spoke. "We are not afraid of you anymore. You can't keep us here. We've escaped before, and we'll do it again. You're done." Her words sent a shockwave through me. I realized then that she wasn't just a scared child, she was brave. She and the boy had been through this before, and somehow, they had survived. Mr. Jennings took a step forward, but the boy quickly stepped in front of the girl, his stance strong and protective. "Stay back," he said, his voice surprisingly confident for someone so young. "You don't control us anymore." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. These children had been through so much, and yet they were fighting back. They weren't going to let Mr. Jennings hurt anyone else. It gave me hope, a small spark of it, but it also filled me with fear. If he had been so dangerous to them, what would he do when he realized he was losing control? Mr. Jennings stood there, staring at the two children with a mixture of fury and disbelief. The tension was so thick that I could feel it in the air, and I held my breath, waiting for what would happen next. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, the world around me frozen as we all waited for the next move. But then, Mr. Jennings did something unexpected. He lowered the rod slightly, his eyes flicking between me and the children. "You think you've won?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he was trying to make some kind of deal. "You think I'm just going to let you go? That you can walk away without consequences?" I could see the anger simmering beneath his calm words. He was trying to buy time, trying to get us to make a mistake. But I wasn't going to fall for it. I glanced at the kids, both of them were still standing tall, their eyes locked on him. They weren't afraid anymore. "We are leaving," the little girl said, her voice firm. "And you can't stop us." Mr. Jennings' lip curled into a sneer. "We'll see about that." He took another step forward, but the boy quickly stepped in front of the girl again, this time holding something small and shiny in his hand. It looked like a broken piece of metal, probably a tool or something they had taken from the shed. But in his hands, it was a weapon, and Mr. Jennings took one look at it before he froze. The tension between them was palpable. No one moved. No one spoke. It was clear that Mr. Jennings was calculating his next move, trying to decide if he could overpower them or if they had the upper hand. "Leave us alone," the boy said again, his voice stronger. "This is over." The air between us crackled with tension as Mr. Jennings eyed the small metal object in the boy's hand. For a brief moment, he seemed unsure of his next move. He was calculating, trying to decide if he could overpower these children or if the situation was slipping from his control. The children were standing their ground, and they weren't backing down. It was clear they had been through much worse than this, and their resolve showed in their posture and the calmness in their voices. "You think that little thing is going to stop me?" Mr. Jennings sneered, but there was something in his voice now, something like doubt. Maybe for the first time, he realized that the tables were turning. The fear he had instilled in them had somehow been replaced with courage, and he didn't know how to handle it. I could feel the strength in these kids now, the same strength I hoped to summon. They weren't the helpless victims they had once been. They were survivors, and they had learned how to fight back. "We are leaving, and you're not going to stop us," the girl repeated, her voice unshaken, but firm. Her gaze never left Mr. Jennings, as if she could see straight through him, straight to his darkest secrets. I slowly edged forward, keeping my eyes on Mr. Jennings. He was so focused on the children that he didn't see me moving behind him. It was now or never. I had to act. I couldn't wait for him to make the first move, or we would all be in danger. I needed to keep him distracted long enough for the children to get away. "Why did you do it, Mr. Jennings?" I asked, my voice steady. "What did you think you were going to accomplish? Taking children, trapping them here. What did you want from them?" He turned to face me, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "You wouldn't understand. It was never about the children, you know. It was about power. Control. The ability to make others bend to your will. That's all it's ever been about." His words sent a shiver down my spine. The more he spoke, the more I realized just how twisted his mind had become. He didn't just take children, he wanted to dominate them, to break them. The truth was uglier than I had imagined, and it sickened me. For a moment, we all stood there in silence, the weight of Mr. Jennings' words hanging in the air. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but the kids were stronger than I had ever imagined. They weren't scared anymore. They weren't backing down. I looked at the girl, and then at the boy, both of them with their eyes fixed on Mr. Jennings. They were ready. They had the courage to leave this nightmare behind, and I would make sure they got away from him. But I needed to do something quick. I couldn't stand there and wait for him to regain control. I made a quick decision. I had to create a diversion, something to buy us enough time for the kids to escape. Without thinking, I turned toward the shed at the back of the property. It was a risk, but it was the only chance we had. If I could reach the shed and make some noise, maybe I could distract Mr. Jennings long enough for the children to run. I sprinted toward the shed, my legs burning as I heard Mr. Jennings shout behind me. "Don't you dare!" His voice was full of rage, but I didn't stop. I pushed the door open and quickly knocked over a pile of old crates, causing a loud crash. The sound echoed through the yard, and Mr. Jennings turned around, his eyes wide with fury. "What are you doing?" he roared, his voice full of madness. It worked. The distraction was enough. I heard the children's footsteps pounding on the dirt as they made a run for it. I didn't look back, but I could hear them, faster and faster, away from the house, away from him. But I wasn't out of the woods yet. Mr. Jennings was coming after me. His footsteps were quick, but I had a head start. I dashed back toward the trees, hoping I could get far enough away before he realized what had happened. As I pieced everything together, my blood ran cold. It wasn't just the candy or the games, he had been slowly grooming her, gaining her trust, without me ever noticing. The most unsettling part. I found out he had been watching Sarah long before I ever even spoke to him. And when I finally confronted him, the chilling truth came out: it wasn't the first time he'd done this. The worst part. I had no idea how many others he'd done it to, and I was left wondering if Sarah was truly his last victim. I trust you enjoyed this video. Please like and share your thoughts in the comment section, give a thumbs up, and subscribe to this channel for more alluring stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.